Monongah, West Virginia, December 6th, 1907, 6:32 in the morning. The men who felt it first weren't near the mine. They were 8 miles away, still in bed, when the ground moved under them. Not a tremor, not thunder. A push, like the earth had flinched. Some said they heard nothing. Some said it was a sound they couldn't describe, more felt than heard, the kind that travels through foundations and bone before it reaches your ears. By the time anyone reached mine number 6, the sky above the head frame was already black, not smoke from a fire, after damp, the airless, poisonous exhaust of a coal seam that burns wrong. It carries the smell of scorched stone and sulfur, and it pours from a shaft mouth the way nothing else does. Pieces of ventilation pipe had landed in fields a quarter-mile out. Some were still burning when they hit the ground. 40 seconds later, a second detonation. Mine number 8, 300 yards away. Then silence, worse than either sound. 362 bodies, officially. Between 100 and 200 more that no one ever counted, because no one had written their names in the register when they went underground that morning. 4 men walked out alive. 4. Everyone feared the blast. Every miner, every foreman, every state inspector who had ever set foot underground knew what methane ignition looked like, and they spent their working lives trying not to cause one. The blast was the thing they feared. The blast was what killed people in coal mines. The blast killed roughly a quarter of them. The rest suffocated in mine number 8, where there was no explosion at all. Mine number 8 never blew. No fire, no collapse, no pressure wave through the tunnels. The surface gauges read normal for the first 2 or 3 minutes. The men inside were at their stations, drilling, loading mules, sitting in the dark at the ventilation trap doors with their oil lamps burning steady, exactly as they had on every shift before. Every one of them died. What killed them was a decision entered into a Fairmont Coal Company ledger roughly 1 year before the disaster. The company had connected both mines, number 6 and number 8, to a single central ventilation fan through a shared underground gallery. 1 fan, 1 airflow circuit, 2 separate operations. It cost less than building 2 independent systems. When the blast in number 6 destroyed the ventilation infrastructure, the air stopped moving in both mines simultaneously. After damp, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide flowed through the connecting passage into number 8, silently, without pressure, through a corridor with no barrier designed to stop it. The men in number 8 probably never heard the explosion. Some may have died without knowing there had been one. If that decision, who made it, who signed off on it, who never once raised a flag, deserves more than a single line in an official investigation report, stay with this. To understand how a cost reduction entry in an office ledger killed hundreds of men in a mine that didn't explode, you have to go back 10 years to what Fairmont Coal actually was and who built it into the largest coal producer in West Virginia. Before 1890, the Monongahela Valley ran on small coal. Dozens of independent operations, each sinking a single shaft no deeper than a few hundred feet. A mine owner in 1885 knew his workers by name. He also knew his ceiling, 50, maybe 80,000 tons a year. Then the railroads came for coal the way they came for everything else, in volumes nobody had anticipated. The steel mills in Pittsburgh were running around the clock. New power stations opening in every major city burned coal by the trainload. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad needed fuel delivered continuously, in quantities the valley's fragmented small mines couldn't supply. By the mid-1890s, the region was sitting on top of demand it couldn't physically meet. Fairmont Coal solved that problem the only way the era knew how: consolidation. Through the 1890s, the Watson and Fleming families bought out independents across Marion County one by one, merged their shafts, merged their infrastructure, merged their labor pools. By 1907, Fairmont was the largest producer in West Virginia. Mines number 6 and number 8 together pulled close to 3.5 million tons a year, the entire regional output from 20 years earlier. Consolidation had a vocabulary. The company called it rationalization. One word covered a lot of ground: merged payrolls, shared equipment, and, somewhere around 1905 or 1906, a single central ventilation fan serving two adjacent mines through a connecting underground gallery instead of two independent systems. The engineering was clean, the savings were real. The logic was consistent with every other decision Fairmont had made for 15 years. Inside, the scale looked different. Mines number 6 and number 8 used room and pillar extraction. Tunnels cut in a grid, coal taken from the rooms, pillars left to hold the ceiling. Each room ran 4 to 6 feet high. A man couldn't stand upright. He worked bent or on his knees in a space lit by one oil lamp throwing 3 feet of light. Beyond that circle, complete darkness. The combined tunnel length of both mines exceeded 20 miles. The mules never came back up. More than 20 of them lived permanently underground, hauling loaded cars toward the main shaft, brought down as foals. They spent their entire working lives below the surface and died there. On the morning of December 6th, between 380 and 500 people were underground. The exact number is still unknown. A significant portion of the workforce were recent Italian immigrants from Calabria, from Molise, employed informally, brought in by a relative already on the payroll, never entered in the official register. The shaft log recorded names. It didn't record everyone who went down. A blaster arriving at 6 in the morning descended into a 15-degree temperature drop before the shaft leveled off. The smell came before anything else. Coal dust, wet limestone, mule, and underneath it, faint, sweet, constant, the methane that every experienced miner cataloged automatically with each breath. Rule older than the shafts themselves. If the smell got stronger, you walked back. What no surviving record addresses is what happened to that background reading and to everyone still at their stations once the single fan serving both mines stopped moving air. Every engineer at Fairmont Coal knew where that fan was. It sat on the surface above mine number 6 in a metal housing the size of a small barn, running around the clock. Everyone knew its job. No document has surfaced showing anyone wrote down what would happen if it failed. The connecting gallery between number 6 and number 8 had a name. Miners called it the crosscut. It was a standard passage, cut to move men and equipment between the two operations without surfacing. Practical, efficient. It also ran directly through the shared ventilation circuit. West Virginia mine safety law in 1907 required ventilation. It specified cubic feet of air per miner per minute. It did not specify that two adjacent mines must breathe independently. The statute was written for individual shafts, not for consolidated operation. Fairmont Coal, by connecting number 6 and number 8 through a shared fan, violated nothing on paper. The ventilation partitions inside the crosscut, stoppings in the trade, were brick and timber, built to manage normal airflow pressure, not blast pressure. When the explosion in number 6 propagated through the workings, those partitions ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The gallery was open. The afterdamp moved through it the way air moves through an open door. A second independent fan and ventilation network for mine number 8 would have cost tens of thousands of dollars once. Monthly production revenue from both mines combined ran into the millions. The actuarial math was straightforward, and within the limits of existing law, it was perfectly legal. West Virginia's regional mine inspector had visited both operations. His filed reports, available in the state archive in Charleston, recorded ventilation status as satisfactory, because by the applicable standard, it was. In 1906, a Fairmont Coal representative spoke at an industry conference in Charleston on the efficiency gains from centralized ventilation infrastructure. No inspector in the room raised an objection. No record of a dissenting engineering memo from inside the company has been made public. Monongah wasn't an aberration. It was a data point in a pattern running back at least 5 years. Fratterville, Tennessee, May 19, 1902, 216 dead. methane ignition, after damp spread through a poorly designed ventilation network. Miners who survived the initial blast left notes in the dark for their families, written by lamplight while the air went bad around them. One letter, from a father to his son, is in the Smithsonian. Official finding: reckless use of open flame by a single miner, Dar Mine, Pennsylvania, December 19, 1907, 13 days after Monongah, 239 dead. Coal dust explosion in a mine where the ventilation system didn't cover the full extent of the working. The company had received an internal engineering proposal months earlier, suggesting water spraying to suppress dust accumulation. It was declined as an unnecessary expense. Official finding: electrical equipment failure, Cherry Mine, Illinois, November 13, 1909, 259 dead. A fire started from burning hay stored underground for the mules. It spread along the timber framing and cut off the only hoisting shaft. The company had no secondary escape route, despite a state law requiring one for any mine deeper than 100 feet. Official finding: error by the hoist operator. 3 different mines, 3 different failure modes, 1 identical conclusion. A specific individual made a specific mistake. Case closed. That conclusion served 2 functions simultaneously. It ended criminal liability for management, and it ended the question of whether the system itself had been designed wrong. Every investigation that reached operator error was an investigation that stopped before it reached the office where the decisions were made. The real statistics were never public. Coal companies in Appalachia treated fatality data as a competitive liability, something that affected insurance premiums, railroad contract terms, and the flow of immigrant labor into the region. The numbers reconstructed by later researchers, working from county court records and church burial registers, suggest somewhere between 2,000 and 3,500 men died annually in American coal mines during the first decade of the 20th century. That figure was the industry's background noise. Monongah was louder, but not different in kind. Peter Urban was Polish. He had been underground since 6. He knew his route well enough to walk it without light, and sometimes did when the lamp went out, and relighting it took longer than just moving forward by memory. At 10:28, something hit him before he heard it. Not sound. Pressure. A wall of air that came from the direction of the main gallery and put him on the ground before his mind registered that anything had happened. The lamp went out. He found the side wall with his hands, found a shallow niche in the stone, pressed his face into his jacket, and held. He didn't know how long he stayed there. There was no sound after the second concussion. Not silence. The absence of the sounds that had been there before. No mule. No iron wheel on rail. No creak of timber under load. Nothing. Urban was one of 4 men who came out alive. He gave testimony. The other 362 did not. December 6th had started at 5:30 in the morning in company housing that Fairmont Coal owned and charged rent for. The only store in Monongah was a company store. The wages came back to the company before most men saw them. A miner who wanted to leave needed money he hadn't yet earned, in a town where there was no other employer and nowhere to go on foot. At 6, the men collected their lamps and signed in. The log recorded official employees, the boys running trapdoors, 10, 12, 13 years old, sitting alone in alcoves off the main passage, opening and closing ventilation gates as the mule trains passed, were not always in the log. Some had come down with their fathers. Some were listed nowhere at all. By 6:15, the shift was moving at full pace, blasters drilling, charges set and cleared, mules pulling loaded cars toward the main shaft, the surface gauges showing normal, fan pressure steady, hoisting running to schedule. 4.5 hours of standard production, 10:28. The surface operator noticed the fan pressure deviation 2 to 3 minutes after the first explosion. By then, the afterdamp had already entered the crosscut. In mine number 8, the men had no warning and no visible cause. The air simply went bad. Carbon monoxide at sufficient concentration produces no smell, no irritation, no signal the body can act on. You lose coordination. You sit down. You don't get up. The official investigation identified the ignition source in number 6, most likely a blown-out shot, a blasting charge that failed to detonate cleanly and ignited the methane. It recorded that ventilation had been compromised by the explosion. The mechanism by which afterdamp traveled from number 6 into number 8 through the shared gallery occupies one sentence in the final report. No criminal charges were filed. Fairmont Coal negotiated compensation individually with families who could find a lawyer and hold out long enough to negotiate. Many couldn't. Some families refused the money, not from principle, but because accepting it required signing documents they couldn't read, in a language they had been in the country too short a time to understand. 171 of the confirmed dead were Italian immigrants, mostly from 2 regions, Calabria and Molise. Villages in those provinces received the news weeks later, by letter. In some of them, a single morning in West Virginia had taken every working-age man who had emigrated from that street, 250 widows, over 1,000 children. The company buried the unidentified and unclaimed at its own expense. The mine reopened within months. New workers came. They were Polish, Italian, Hungarian, the same categories as before, men who had arrived recently enough that they had no prior knowledge of what the place had done. Fairmont Coal didn't pause production for a single day. The company was not an independent operation. By 1907, it sat inside Consolidation Coal, controlled through the financial architecture of J.P. Morgan's Bank and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Monongah was not a mine. It was a supply node in a logistics chain. The railroad needed coal delivered on schedule. The bank needed the asset to perform. The mine performed. The cost of a second independent ventilation system for number 8, tens of thousands of dollars once. Compensation paid to a miner's family in 1907, between nothing and a few $100s, depending on whether the widow had any leverage at all. The average annual profit from both mines exceeded their combined construction cost. These numbers were known. They appear in corporate records that became public decades later. No one at the time published them together in the same document and drew the obvious line. United Mine Workers of America was organizing across West Virginia during this period, not in Monongah. Fairmont Coal ran a company town, housing, food, medical access, all of it owned and priced by the same entity that issued the paychecks. To organize meant to risk the job. Losing the job meant losing the house the same week. The company had structured the dependency precisely enough that the two things, employment and survival, were the same thing. After the disaster, UMWA attempted to use Monongah as an organizing argument. Fairmont responded by recruiting replacement workers from the newest arrivals at the eastern ports, men who had been in the country weeks, not months, men who had no existing relationship with anyone in the labor network, no name recognition for the union, no English. The mine reopened. The union made no measurable gains in Marion County. Congress held hearings. Newspapers ran the photographs of the widows. The number, 250, appeared in print repeatedly because round numbers hold attention. Several legislators introduced mine safety bills. The coal lobby, coordinated across the major producing states, engaged the committee process the way it had engaged every previous attempt at federal oversight, with patience, technical objections, and the argument that safety was a state matter. The U.S. Bureau of Mines was established in 1910. It could study accidents. It could publish findings. It could recommend. It had no authority to enter a mine and halt production. No operator was required to implement a single recommendation it issued. Mandatory federal mine safety standards with actual enforcement powers, the right to inspect without invitation, to issue citations to stop work, came with the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969, 62 years after Monongah. In those 62 years, the industry killed several tens of thousands more. The logic that connected all of it was not negligent. Negligence implies someone forgot to calculate. The calculations were made. The repair cost more than the liability. The liability was bounded by what courts would award, and courts in coal-producing counties awarded little. The compensation ceiling was a known input in a known equation, and the equation produced a known result. That result has a document trail. The problem was never that no one wrote it down. Mine number 8 closed in 1961, not because of the dead, not because of the law, because the seam ran out, or rather, because the cost of extracting what remained crossed above the market price of what came out. The same arithmetic that had connected 2 mines to 1 fan in 1905 disconnected the second mine from its workforce 56 years later. The shaft entrance was filled. The company town dispersed. What Monongah became after 1907 wasn't a memorial. It was a replacement. New workers had arrived in 1908, 1909, 1910. The same demographics, different names. They hadn't known the men from December. They had no shared memory of that morning, and no particular reason to acquire one. The community that had existed before 6:32 a.m. on December 6th, the one where a Polish miner and an Italian blaster and a Hungarian trapper boy were connected through 3 years of the same shifts in the same company store, that community ended in one event and was never reassembled. What replaced it functioned, but it wasn't the same thing. That loss doesn't appear in any official count. What Monongah did produce at the institutional level was incremental. West Virginia passed new mine safety statutes in 1908, the first to require a minimum number of exits from any working mine and mandatory registration of every person who went underground. The U.S. Bureau of Mines followed in 1910. It published reports on ventilation failures, on after-damp toxicity, on the specific failure modes that connected shafts in consolidated operations. Operators were not required to read them. In 2007, on the centennial, the town of Monongah dedicated 2 monuments. One for the Italian victims, 171 names, the largest single concentration of Italian immigrant dead in American industrial history. Villages in Calabria and Molise had observed December 6th quietly for a century before anyone in West Virginia erected a marker. The second monument depicted not a miner. It depicted a widow. The figure is based on Caterina Davia, whose husband went down on the morning shift and did not come back up. She received what the company offered. The records don't show how much. The regulations that followed Monongah, through the Bureau of Mines, through the 1952 Federal Mine Safety Act, through the full enforcement authority of the 1969 law, made the specific scenario legally impossible to repeat. 2 adjacent mines, sharing a single ventilation node with no independent backup, no secondary circuit, no blast barrier between them. That configuration is now prohibited. Every standard that prohibits it exists because the configuration was tried and the result was documented. That's how the standards were written, not in advance. Each one traces back to a specific failure that had already occurred. Peter Urban went back underground. He had no other income and no other skill set recognized by any employer in Marion County. He worked the mines for 19 more years. In 1926, he died in a shaft accident. The record lists the cause. It does not note that he had been one of 4 men to survive Monongah. He knew what the mine was. He had been inside it when it killed everyone else, and he went back every morning for 19 years. Not because he'd forgotten, because there was nowhere else to go. The shaft entrance at Monongah is sealed. The ground above the old workings has subsided in places. Slow surface collapse as the pillars that held the room and pillar chambers finally gave way. Decades after the last shift. You can see it if you know where to look. Shallow depressions in a field, running in a rough grid. The shape of the rooms, pressing up through the earth from 300 feet down. The machine that caused it is gone. The law that permitted it has been rewritten. The men are long buried. The grid is still there.